I'm done with Lords of the Fallen. I will not be continuing it. It is one of the most disappointing games I've ever played, and I did not come to this conclusion lightly. I love Souls games, and I love Souls-like games as well. And while a game's resume in terms of what you've played and beaten isn't really that important, I just want to preface this by saying this is coming from the perspective of somebody who's played and beaten all of the From Software games, and who's played and beaten a lot of these, off-brand Souls-like titles as well. And for Lords of the Fallen, I was unbelievably excited to get my hands and play this. Another dark fantasy game that really suits my aesthetic taste. Just a little something to scratch that particular itch before the Elden Ring DLC comes out. This game I was putting so much behind, and I thought I was going to quite enjoy myself. And unfortunately, spoilers from the title, I'm not. Really at all, to be honest. I also do want to thank CI Games for giving me a code to play Lords of the Fallen, and I just want to say, absolutely no disrespect to anybody who worked on this game at all, but I wanted to review this, and I unfortunately don't think I'm going to end up finishing the game, and I'll explain why. Let me begin by saying I think there are generally two different archetypes of Souls game enjoyers. There are, let's say, two reasons why people primarily get something out of these games. The first kind of player, I think, really enjoys the slow-paced nature of a lot of the games, especially older Dark Souls, where you're exploring this giant, thorough world, and they don't mind really taking their time to explore every corner, get every item. They will take their time in combat or use, whatever tactics necessary. They'll find out exactly what a boss is weak to and use every item at their disposal in order to exploit that vulnerability or weakness in the boss. Somebody that's just going to take their time exploring every single inch thoroughly of the game. And then I feel like you have different kinds of Souls players who enjoy the technicality of combat in, games like Bloodborne, Sekiro, etc. These kinds of players derive satisfaction from refining their own personal skill at an encounter, for example, learning boss fights and really honing in and downloading their entire moveset, mastering a boss so it becomes untouchable. These kinds of players may not end up exploring every inch in the world like the prior kind of player, but will throw themselves again and again at a boss until they absolutely mechanically perfect it. The world design is less of a feature and more of an obstacle to get through until your next boss, which is treated as the main content. And so here's the thing. These are two ends of a spectrum, and most players are not fully one or the other. If any of these attributes sound like they apply to you, you may find yourself leaning towards one side. I feel like, me personally, I lean towards a bit more the latter. What I get out of Souls games and what's personally most satisfying to me is when the game demands perfection out of me and I can present that forth rightly. There's nothing more satisfying than fully learning and understanding a boss to a point where fighting it becomes virtually second nature and you no longer become fearful of it. You become the boss in some way, which is why Sekiro is one of my favorite Souls games ever. And that's not to say that I don't enjoy elements of that, let's say, qualities of the prior player, where I actually do enjoy a fair amount of exploration. I like really, getting down and looking for a place's secrets, and I enjoy story and lore, etc. There are a lot of qualities and elements of that prior player I described that also apply to me. But when push comes to shove, I would describe myself more as the second kind of player, where gameplay is king to me. A game can have the most brilliantly written story. It can have the most gorgeous aesthetics and visuals. It can have an absolute banger soundtrack, but if the gameplay fundamentally isn't fun, then I'm not with it. Now, the reason I'm saying that is because Lords of the Fallen has almost all of those things. If these values are something that you personally find important, then Lords of the Fallen does check those boxes. I think this game has an incredible art direction and visual style. It was insanely impressive, and it really gave me a sense that Lords of the Fallen was carving its own path and forging its own identity through its unique visuals and art style and everything, and I really appreciate that. To say that this game doesn't have any atmosphere is wrong. I think the atmosphere is top-notch for what this setting demands of it. I think the music is awesome, and the lore is very interesting in this game as well. The voice acting is a little questionable, but anyways. And also, I really like the core combat mechanics on paper, and I think it takes a valuable lesson from every single From Software game. So this game's combat is pretty much, let's say, Dark Souls 3 / Elden Ring kind of pacing, but it has the parry system from Sekiro and even Bloodborne to a degree. It has health rallying from Bloodborne. It has the second chance revive system and so much more. You can see the influence in the combat from every single From Software game, that's pretty obvious. But that's not even a bad thing. On paper, that is the best thing about Lords of the Fallen. So let's lay this out. We have this extremely fascinating and large-scale, intricate world to explore and discover things. We have an incredible set of bosses in Lords of the Fallen. We've got an amazing combat system and so much more. So what could go so wrong? There was a moment when I realized something horrible about this game, and it was sad because I tried to give every single video game I play, not just Souls-like games, an equal fair opportunity. I tried to give these the same amount of playtime that I would anything else and an equal amount of attention. I want everything I play to have a fair shake against the other, but I had this sinking feeling that was horrible when I realized that I just wasn't having like any fun playing this game. And it was a couple of bosses in, fair amount of way into the game, and I was waiting for the fun to begin. Now, I understand a lot of my criticisms of Lords of the Fallen are just going to be met with a skill issue or get good or whatever overused saying that there is now to discredit somebody who is criticizing something. And that's fine. I just want to say that this is my opinion. You are absolutely entitled to yours, and I really do think that Lords of the Fallen is going to cater a lot better to players who found themselves in Category 1. If you are that first kind of Dark Souls player that I described at the beginning of the video, then I actually think a lot of these critiques are going to be nullified for you. However, if you find yourself a bit more aligned with my viewpoint, then let's proceed. The first thing I want to mention, and I probably should have talked about it earlier, but it's not really a gameplay thing, it's just the fact that the performance right now is not really in an optimal state. I played this on PlayStation 5 in performance mode, and it's usually fine when you are in just any level traversal encounters, but anytime there's more than 3 or 4 enemies on the screen at the same time, the performance goes in the absolute dumpster, and if you're in the Umbral mode during that, forget about it. I hear it runs even worse on PC at the moment, so that is all to say that the performance is just not there yet. Maybe that will change in future patches, but that's not really why we're here. Now for me, Lords of Fallen, while it works on paper, is basically death by 1,000 paper cuts in practical terms. So the whole entire premise of this game and level traversal is that you essentially have these 2 different modes you can be in. You can be like a normal human essentially, and then you can die in this lantern and go into this umbral mode that completely changes a lot of level layout. You know, traversal is required. You can unlock new paths in this umbral mode and so on. You have this lantern mechanic where you can, you know, soul flay and do all these weird crazy things. Basically, this umbral mode is an integral mechanic to getting around the game, and a lot of actual level progression has to be done in this mode where you unlock new secret paths and walkable space, etc. And while it was really cool initially, I thought this was an amazing idea. I was having a blast with this and a ton of fun in the tutorial mode and like a lot of the, you know, opening parts of the game. I thought this was a neat feature. However, after a few hours, it really did start to wear on me, and I thought I was the only one. When I was playing this by myself, I just thought that this mechanic really wasn't doing it for me, but now I've asked a couple of friends of mine and some people, and I've heard a lot of the same sentiment that this Umbral mode thing just kind of gets annoying. Umbral mode also acts as a second chance in combat, where if you die as a normal human, then you will respawn and have another chance in this Umbral mode, and if you die in Umbral, then you die, you know, permanently in the game. Just like if you die in Canada, you die in real life. And again, while I really like this as a theory, Umbral mode in terms of level traversal became really sloppy and honestly just kind of unfun and tedious. When you're traversing the levels as a normal human, you constantly have to be whipping out your lantern to look for secret little hidden pathways or passages or something like that, and that's fine in and of itself, but you realize that later in the game, after a couple of hours, the enemy spam starts to become so intense that pulling out this lantern constantly to look for stuff just is a huge contradiction to the game design. I think this whole system would be completely fine if it were a bit more optional. Like if you could actually traverse the entire game without using Umbral, maybe the Umbral realm would make it easier, but if you theoretically could still do it just as a normal human and didn't really have to flip into this mode, then I think it would be much less of a problem. But in its current implementation, this became like an actual chore. Using the lantern to grab these doors in the Umbral mode and like rip them open and stuff, or like soul flay them, whatever, this, instead of being heart pounding and exciting, was just so incredibly annoying and raised my blood pressure. Now, when it comes to level design, it is a giant mixed bag because I've realized that as a player, I can really appreciate linear levels when it's in a linear game. I like Elden Ring's world because it's meant to be an open world game. Lords of the Fallen is not an open world game, so to speak, but it has more open-ended level design, which is usually very hit or miss for me, and in this case, really doesn't work at all. On the flip side, Lies of P level design, for the most part, is really up my alley. Yes, it is linear, but it has a lot of fun and interesting shortcuts once you do chew through that level design. It's a little bit, less heavy on the exploration side of things, but if you want a really well thought out level, I think Lies of P does a pretty good job at that. I don't think Lords of the Fallen really has very good level design, especially in terms of what I usually get out of these games. There are a few moments here and there where it's like, oh, that's a really neat shortcut. I cannot believe that this route ends up to where, my vestige point was up here. That's insane. But also, worse yet with the level design, when I was talking about at the beginning of the video that there are certain kinds of Dark Souls players that just love exploring every inch of every level and collecting all the items and stuff, that would be fine. But what you realize in Lords of the Fallen, at least in my build, in my particular playthrough and whatnot, I really wasn't finding a whole lot of items that were even useful to me whatsoever. There were maybe a handful in the opening levels, but honestly, as I got into the mid levels, there wasn't anything that I was adding to my build at all. There was just nothing relevant. So it made the actual exploration of it feel kind of pointless anyways. Now, in reality, it does have some cool item stuff. There's a really neat system with armor dyeing and everything like that. Like, that's awesome, and the weapon upgrading system is fantastic as well. I will say, the way to get the ability to upgrade is kind of stupid. It's a NPC side quest to even unlock the blacksmith, and for me, it glitched out in my game until I reset it, and I didn't know it was glitched until I left and played it the next day. A staple feature in every From Software game and every Souls-like game are its checkpoint system, usually bonfires or lanterns or grace or, whatever. Just whatever checkpoint that your character respawns at is a fundamental basic building block of this genre of game, and they've all got them. In this game, you have these, vestiges, and there are a lot of, main ones in the game, but you also have the ability to create them with these vestige seeds where you can kind of choose your respawn point, which again, interesting idea, but in practicality, it ends up being a mechanic that is there for really just to be different. You need these vestige seeds, which are a limited resource to plant one of these, temporary respawn points, and you can only really have one at a time. People will be like, oh, it's so that you are being strategic and tactical about where you're choosing your next respawn point and all this stuff. It just, I can understand the idea behind it. It just doesn't need to be here, and it doesn't make any sense for this level design. It in some sense feels like a cop-out for having actual good level design where it's intended for you to go back to a main spawn point. Again, there's a little bit of that stuff in here, but this choose your own vestige system, it just doesn't need to be in the game, and it just makes no sense. And myself and a lot of other people just found this quite frustrating. This made the game more generally, and especially trying to cut through and traverse the levels, very pranky, cruel, and just not rewarding, and sort of oppressive for no other reason than just bullying the player. Now let's talk about maybe the most important piece to it all, which is the boss fights, because again, in my perspective and a lot of people who play these games, the bosses are the most important component of the game to get right, and if you don't, then it really suffers for it. I think the bosses in Lords of the Fallen are terrible. To be honest, they're just not very good. The best boss in the game that I've played so far is probably the opening boss. That is the one that I had the most fun with. Everything else either becomes incredibly tedious, a little bit gimmicky. I think these bosses take a lot out of the page of Demon Souls, where, they're not exactly gimmick bosses, but they do have one specific type of vulnerability that you more or less need to exploit or attack them at. And if you're good at parrying, you can just do that to delete half the bosses on this roster anyways. And speaking of parrying, oh my god, I know I wasn't the only one, because I went and asked people later and they felt the same way. The parry sound in this game is so bad. I didn't really know exactly how to put it, but my friend said it sounds like fairy dust. In Sekiro, when you get a perfect parry, you get this godly sound of these, metal katanas clashing and these swords and metal clanking together. It's so satisfying and visceral. This game, you get Fairy Godmother. And it's not only just the sound, but it's the feel and the visual feedback of pairing does not feel good in this game at all. It's so bizarre how they managed to get that so backwards, and I think that takes away a lot of what this combat could be potentially achieving. It's really sad. But beyond that, boss fights can just be boring and super tedious, where it's almost a battle between, can I beat this boss? Not before I die, but before I get bored, honestly. And again, yes, I haven't played every boss in this game, and so, you know, if people are going to say, oh, dude, it starts getting good after these bosses or whatever, I don't really care. I don't need to play through like 7 or 8 bosses before a game starts to get good, before I start finding any of the fun. That's fundamentally where Lords of the Fallen fell apart for me, is I was just constantly sitting here, miserable playing it, waiting for the fun to begin, and it just never does. There is a bright spot of enjoyment here and there, but as an overall experience, I was not having any enjoyment really whatsoever. And again, even with the level design and the bosses, I'm not going to sit here and play through like 20 hours of a game before it actually starts getting fun. That's just ridiculous. For one reason or another, I'm just not really vibing with this game, and as I mentioned earlier, that's probably largely due to the type of Souls player that I am, where I really do think that this is going to work for one specific archetype of Souls player and probably not the other. Lies of P and Lords of the Fallen are pretty much opposites, where I think Lies of P works a lot more for somebody like me. I'm not even saying that game is perfect. I have my own criticisms of that, and I already have. But in terms of what it's going for, where it's more centric around the combat and bosses and stuff like that, level design's a bit more linear and quick, and it's meant to get you to those boss encounters, where Lords of the Fallen is a bit more, you know, slow-paced, exploratory, etc. Just not really for me. So I'm going to leave you with a word of caution. If you're thinking about playing and buying Lords of the Fallen, and you also find yourself resonating with a lot of my values and stuff that I like out of video games, then I would be very careful about this one. Unless you are absolutely sold on one aspect or another, I would be quite careful before committing to a game like this. If you're looking for something that falls way more in line with the qualities that I like out of Dark Souls games, and you want a similar Souls-like, I actually think Lies of P is probably going to work better for you. I just think that these two games work on totally opposite spectrums. So if you hated Lies of P, there maybe is a good chance you'll love Lords of the Fallen and vice versa. And if you chalk up all of my criticisms to get good or a skill issue, that's fine. I just don't really care to sink more time into a game that is just really not fun. The deeper I get into this game, the more tired and irritated I get instead of having more and more fun with it and becoming invested. And that is the core problem at the end of the day. But I wanted to talk about this while it was still fresh in my brain. This wasn't scripted, but I hope you guys enjoyed it nonetheless and hope you got something out of it. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.